Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for tuning in to another episode of Beers and Bullshit. I'm your host, Cole, and today I have a special edition episode coming here for you. Not only am I going to be by myself here hosting this show, I'm going to go ahead and dive right into March Madness. We're going to be talking the NCAA tournament, something that was probably the first major event canceled in 2020. I just remember last year we're dealing with about a year of the coronavirus now here. Recording this, I believe it's March 16th, 2021. When we're recording this, should be dropping within a day or two. But yeah, about a year ago, we were just all set to have the tournament kick up, and then before we know it, it was canceled right before our very eyes. And unfortunately, things just haven't kind of been the same since. But obviously, we return with a little bit more normalcy here with the 2021 NCAA tournament. I'm going to be reviewing the men's just because obviously, a little bit more popular and just where my knowledge definitely is as well. But we'll be watching and betting both on the men's and women's tournament. A lot of exciting teams, a lot of exciting storylines kind of digging in here. So, before we get going here, I do want to shout out a beer sponsor. I'm not drinking anything here tonight, but I do want to shout out Guinness just because we do have St. Patrick's Day coming up here tomorrow. So, ladies and gentlemen, grab yourself a Guinness, celebrate the Irish, in proper style here. Go ahead and support your, fellow friends of the Irish descent and just anybody who enjoys wearing green and having a good time. So, once again, Guinness beer. Going to go ahead and shout that out on behalf of my co-host, Jace, who once again is on a little hiatus here. The man probably takes part in an eighth of the things that are going on, Jace. So I love you. Can't wait till you come back shouting out Guinness on your behalf. But without further ado, we are going to get into the 2021 NCAA men's basketball tournament. So the NCAA basketball tournament, what does it mean to everybody? Now I get it. Some people are not a fan of March Madness. I can get it if you're not a fan of basketball or college sports. College football alone is really hard to follow. I mean, there's 120 teams in Division One alone. So it just becomes really hard to kind of keep track of those teams. On top of that, you break them down into different conferences. It becomes very confusing because some conferences are divided into even sub-conferences from there. You're talking about division on top of a division here to where people can, very much get lost and confused easily if they don't understand the concept of it. So when you get to NCAA men's basketball and you're talking about Division One and Division Two playing together in this tournament, you're talking about over 400 teams every single year that can qualify for this tournament, bringing it down to a series of 68 teams that are selected. Everything from your powerhouses, your big dogs, teams you've heard of and you've recognized as champions over the years. Some names you're going to hear again in this NCAA tournament. You're going to hear names like North Carolina, Wisconsin, Kansas, UCLA, Villanova, Georgetown, just to name a few. For the first time, though, the 2021 tournament feels like almost empty, with two blue chip programs in Duke and Kentucky not even qualifying this year. 2021 has thrown us through a loop through everything, just like 2020 did. And obviously, the college basketball season spanning both years, it's thrown us through the biggest loop of all. But we're still happy to be back here. We're still happy to have the 2021 NCAA men's tournament because in 2020 we didn't. I think one of just the biggest traditions that I love in America is the fact that every single year you can get someone who knows not a lick about basketball, not a lick about college basketball. But every year, everybody fills out that bracket because it's the unpredictable. It's the mystique of what happens. You don't know what's going to happen in any single game. Sure, the teams are seeded, but any given time, the best team in the nation can be beat by, we would consider an absolute nobody. I mean, it's just absolutely fantastic how you can find these teams that come from just nowhere and they have these Cinderella runs in the NCAA tournament. So before I break down the tournament and how it goes for those of you who don't know, I'm going to start off with some of those Cinderella teams. And I have about 5 on my list here. The greatest underdog NCAA runs of all time. So once again, just to set the stage here, the NCAA tournament now these days sits at 68 teams. Back in the day, there's different times where it consisted of 52 teams, 40 teams, even as low as 16 teams in the initial inauguration of the tournament. So it's crazy to see how it's grown over the years. But I'm going to start off here with one that's more recent to any NCAA, fans' memory, and that's going to be the 2013 Florida Gulf Coast Eagles. Nicknamed Dunk City, God, this was such a fun time to watch college basketball. I loved watching Florida Gulf Coast. And sure, they didn't last too deep in the tournament, but they were the first 15 seed to upset a 2 seed, and then they go on and then make the Sweet 16 after that. It was incredible. I mean, this was a field of 64 where I believe in a couple of years they would expand it 4 teams to include those playing games. And Florida Gulf Coast was a respectable Division II team, finishing at 26-11. Their quick aerial attack shocked number 2 Georgetown in the round one, beating them 78-68. They followed that up with the talented San Diego State team, who may have been seated a bit low, and that set them up with the number 3 older brother of the state, University of Florida Gators. And sure, Florida beat them by 12, but it was a magical run that any younger fan will enjoy and sure remember. Just the pure charisma. You can't even remember the name of the head coach. I actually had to look up team names and players, and even off the top, I didn't write them down in my notes, forgot them instantly. But Florida Gulf Coast, I can remember those blue jerseys with the slight green outlines and numbers. The team throwing up what seemed to be like 20 different alley-oops a game. Shocking Georgetown. I watched that game just because it was on in the afternoon, and then all of a sudden I noticed, hey, this 15 seed might beat a 2 seed. Georgetown was a top 10 ranked team. I mean, they were rated, obviously, second in their region, which means they're going to be a top 8 team as far as, what the committee voters decided to go against. And who comes out of nowhere but little Florida Gulf Coast and knocks them off? And then they go into the next round and take care of a San Diego State team who easily could have upset a couple of brackets. And I believe even that year, if I were to look back, I probably had them go into the Sweet 16 or Elite 8 myself. This was a time when San Diego State seemed to be shocking everybody. So for Florida Gulf Coast to take down both Georgetown and San Diego State, sure, their luck ran out against Big Brother Florida of the same state. But still, I pick them as my number 5 because personally, they were one of my favorite Cinderella runs to watch of my life. Number 4, coming up next, I'm going to have the 2006 George Mason Patriots. Now, I was born in 1994. Being a sports fan, I'd probably say I started watching the NCAA tournament or paying attention to it rather in depth, maybe 2002, 2003 time. It's kind of when I started expanding outside of football into basketball, and I actually got into college basketball a little bit more than I got into NBA basketball originally. Starting out, George Mason was the first underdog story that I ever remember watching and being able just to witness, because it had been about 15 years since an underdog had done substantial work in the NCAA tournament. And with the field at 64 teams, you saw the usual upset or two maybe in the first or second round, but a lot of the tournament consisted of heavy Final Four favorites and predictable national championship games against 1 and 2 seeds. Then you have George Mason flipping the script in 2006. They might not have even made the tournament in a not too different world, losing the conference tournament semifinals in a conference that they were supposed to win. George Mason still earned an at-large bid at the 11 seed, thanks to their 23-7 record, though. Once in the tournament, though, they didn't disappoint. Wins over number 6 seed Michigan State, 3-seeded North Carolina, and 7-seeded Wichita State set them up in the Elite 8 with the number 1 seed and the number 2 team in the nation, UConn. They stunned them 86-84 in an overtime thriller, which was the pinnacle of George Mason's run. Because during this time, you got to remember the tournament starts off and they play 2 games in a city. So they play the round of 64 and 32 in one city. And then they would flip over and they play the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8 in whatever region the city was hosting. And that year, it was Washington, D.C., which is where George Mason is settled at. So essentially, Sweet 16 and the Elite 8 were home games for George Mason. Unfortunately, when they went to Indianapolis for the Final Four, that's kind of when their luck ran out, because they'd played number 1 seeded Florida, who had national championship material written all over them. Florida took care of them handedly because they had future NBA stars Al Horford and Joakim Noah going. But still, George Mason, man, they seem to open the door to what's been the past 15 years of incredible upsets, Cinderella runs, and just almost every single year we find ourselves with one of those underdog seeds going, maybe this is the year. Maybe this is the year someone shocks the world and actually, wins a title at underneath an 8 seed. We've seen it almost happen before. Because moving on here, my number 3 team is going to be the 2018 Loyola Chicago Ramblers. Now, who can forget Sister Jean, or the continued string of upsets that this team had? Their mascot was a 100-year-old nun who would just sit by the sideline and just go crazy for this Loyola team. And this one sits near to my heart because I had Loyola beating that 6-seeded Miami team in the first round as like my prominent upset. I picked it in most of my brackets. And for once, I actually got my upset picks right. I could not have predicted what followed, though, because nail-biting wins over the 3-seeded Tennessee team and 7-seeded Nevada led to an Elite 8 walloping of Kansas State and a date in the Final Four with number 7 Michigan. Michigan made the feisty squad work, though, winning 57-69. But Loyola inspired the nation, and all while having a 100-year-old nun as their mascot. I checked back, though. I believe she was 99 during that season. So Loyola was fantastic, though, because that was a true time you saw an 11 seed just go late game win, late game win, late game win. You were biting your nails at every single Loyola game, and it was fantastic. Once again, the magic runs out, but still, it's just the fact that they were there, and they made us believe just for a moment that the little guy could do it. Moving on to number 2, I got the 2011 Butler Bulldogs. Now, actually, the 2010 team featured Gordon Hayward and was one mid-court heave away from a national title. And I remember that. I thought that ball was going in. I was like, no way. Am I really going to watch this? And I believe it was an 8 seed at the time, Butler, or 11 seed. Butler beat Duke. Alas, that wasn't to be. Gordon Hayward goes into the NBA, but there's a reason that Brad Stevens is in the NBA now coaching the Boston Celtics. Obviously, he's a great coach. Now, Butler, coming off of that national championship, wasn't really 100% an underdog, but they were still seated at the 8th seed. And they were definitely less talented, everybody could agree, as the year before because they lost, once again, Gordon Hayward. They didn't project well as far as having that star player who could take over and really dominate games. I mean, shoot, in the first round, they nearly lost to 9 seed Old Dominion. But apparently that shook them straight because after that, they won 71-70 against the number 1 seed in Pitt. 61-54 against the 4 seed Wisconsin, and then pulled it out in overtime by 3, 74-71 against Florida. Ruining the dreams of a fellow Cinderella story, 11 seeded Virginia Commonwealth University was the cherry on the cake, though, as they lost 41-53 in one of the lowest scoring title games in the modern era. I remember watching that national championship game, and Butler, they just kind of let you down because you felt like they could win that game. The lack of star power, though, and the harder competition, though, I think puts this Butler team in 2011 over that 2010 team for me. Because as much as I love Gordon Hayward, and you could say that that Butler team was better, that Butler team, was lower seeded, that Butler team had to face Duke in the national championship game, for God's sakes, where I believe these guys had to play Michigan. Still, though, at the end of the day, that 2011 team had moxie. And shout out to Shelvin Mack, who I believe is playing in the Chinese Basketball Association, who was the best player on that team. Now, number 1, though, for when you talk about Cinderella stories, I was not alive to watch this myself, but I have watched the 30 for 30 that is based on this team far too many times, and that is going to be the 1983 NC State Wolfpack. Nicknamed the Cardiac Pack, what else can you say except for the original underdog story? They struggled with injuries during the year with some of their top talent, like Derek Wittenberg, their star shooting guard / point guard, going out with a leg injury for about, I think it was 6 to 8 weeks. And they were an outside shot to make the NCAA tournament. Good team, ranked early on in the season, but struggled with injuries and the losses started to pile up. Finishing with 11 losses in the regular season, it seemed like winning the ACC championship was the only way that they were going to get to the NCAA tournament. So they had to win out. Luckily for them, though, the field just expanded from 48 to 52 teams, so there was a small hope of that at-large bid, but why not just lock it in by winning in the ACC? So they start off in the first round beating Wake Forest, which was almost expected. But then, afterwards, they draw the University of North Carolina, the defending national champions, who might have had a kid you might have heard of starting at their 2-guard position. His name is Mike Jordan. Well, they go ahead and run through them too, setting up a matchup with number 2 Virginia, which was led by all-time great college player Ralph Sampson. You might know him from being the 7'2" guy who probably inspired Stretch off of the NBA Street Games because this guy was an absolute college legend, and he was great in the pros too. If it wasn't for injuries, Ralph Sampson would be talked about probably. I think it's probably a top 5, top 10 center. I believe he's still in the NBA Hall of Fame and still had a respectable career, but man, this guy absolutely dominated in college to the point to where NC State had lost twice to Virginia previously in the year. But they still went through them. They ran through the whole ACC tournament. Well, that's easy enough, right? Just go ahead and beat, 2 of the highest nationally ranked teams on top of the number 2 team in the nation. But Jim Valvano's Cardiac Pack was just getting started. They drew a 6 seed in the NCAA tournament, which may not seem like an underdog state, but they got slotted in the West region, which had the top 4 seeds all finishing in the top 11 of the final NCAA polls. And all at one point in the season, 3 of those teams had been ranked number 1. So, due to the tournament structure at the time, the top 4 seeds in each region got a bye week. So, NC State being the 6th seed actually starts off playing number 11 Pepperdine for the right to play UNLV. They run past Pepperdine, of course, but UNLV at the time had won 24 of their last 25 games, and were one of the nation's highest scoring offenses. Sure, Pepperdine gave NC State fits and actually drove him to overtime, but I think that's exactly what woke the Cardiac Pack up, because in the next round, they went to double overtime against the Runner Rebels and shocked the world, beating them 71-70 to advance to the Sweet 16. NC State then made quick work of fellow Cinderella story, number 10 UHaw, in which another game they were actually favored to set up a rematch with conference rival Virginia. Now, keep in mind at this time, Virginia still had 2 wins on them, and NC State had barely eked out a win in the conference championship game. Virginia said, "Fool me once, but you're not going to fool me twice." They had the 2-1 advantage going in the game, and NC State, though, true to their billing to the Cardiac Pack, won 62-61, with the go-ahead basket coming with about 7 seconds left, and Ralph Sampson missing a potential game-winning shot as the time expired. I mean, and this set up a matchup with the number 1 seeded team at the time, Houston, because in the NCAA in 1983, if there was one team that was better than Virginia, it was Houston, because the Houston Cougars were looking to be one of the strongest teams on paper in NCAA history. They were led by future NBA stars and Hall of Famers Clyde the Glide Drexler and Hakeem the Dream Olajuwon. That is right. Let's go ahead and run that back one more time. That's Clyde Drexler and Hakeem Olajuwon. This is a Houston team that had both of those guys playing at the same time. And NC State actually started off, and at halftime, they were up 8 points. They were leading 33-25 going into halftime. But Houston apparently figured out what the hell was going on and quickly turned the game around, because out of the gates in the second half, NC State scored 2 points the first 10 minutes, and Houston quickly jumped out to a 9-point lead. And if any NCAA fan remembers from this time, which unfortunately I don't, NC State slowly but surely fought back in the game to make it to the point where the last 2 to 3 minutes is just a slug back and forth. NC State up. Houston's up. So, finally, we go to a play that most people have seen time and time again. It runs on NCAA highlight reels every single year during the NCAA tournament during the Final Four. You see the play. It happens. The ball's up top, passing around, going around, trying to run the shot clock down to get the last shot. Finally, a pass from the point guard to Derek Wittenberg almost gets intercepted by a Houston player, but not quite, as Derek Wittenberg gets both hands on the ball. He turns, dribbles, goes up a couple of feet, and launches the ball from 30 feet out. It's short. But luckily enough, Lorenzo Charles, forward, is just standing right there for NC State under the hoop. He quickly grabs the ball, lays it up off the board as time expires, giving NC State the title win. It's still the greatest Cinderella story of all time, in my opinion. I mean, you had this team who, it was survive and advance. That's what their 30 for 30 is actually called, is survive and advance, because that's all it was for this team. Win, get to the next one, win, get to the next one for 9 straight games. It was win or go home. It was win or it's the end of the season. A team that started out the season with promise, but injuries took away, finally came together when the time was right and became the ultimate underdog. Sure, they're no George Mason, they're no Virginia Commonwealth University, Butler, but NC State was the true first underdog that absolutely just opened the door to the chaos that we see in the NCAA tournament now. And it's probably one of the best things about March, because I'm going to go ahead and break down the entire tournament that we see forward going here in 2021, and I'm going to give you a couple of spoilers to what I think are going to be some upsets that are going to be going on. And yeah, you might think I'm crazy, but stay tuned. You might agree with them as well. So, but without further ado, though, let's dig into the 2021 NCAA tournament. And I want to start just talking about how the bracket breaks down. So we have 68 teams overall. Now, in a 64-team tournament, it's pretty easy. You have 4 separate regions. Teams are seeded 1 through 16, and the high seeds play the low seed. 1 plays 16, 2 plays 15, 3 plays 14, and so on and so forth. As the rounds go on, you have your matchups that are predetermined already. So, for example, as 1 plays 16, they will play the winner of who plays 8 and 9. The 5 seed plays the 12 seed, and the 4 seed plays the 13 seed, and those winners play. The 6 seed plays the 11, the 3 seed plays the 14 seed, and the winners of those play, along with finally the 7 and 10 seed playing, and the 2 and the 15 seed playing. If that seems like a lot, just download a bracket off of NCAA.com and you'll catch up with me here shortly. Obviously, from there, we'll break it down a little bit more as far as what teams could potentially play and what kind of second, third, fourth round matchups can you see leading all the way up to the national championship game. But once again, just to kind of preface this tournament, we're talking about the first NCAA tournament that has happened in 2 years, because in 2020, both the men's and the women's tournaments were canceled, and now it's back. And in the true madness, sports gambling is legal in more states. I definitely plan on gambling, even though here in South Dakota, there's still no sites that do it. But it is legal after the election, so fantastic. If you want to go out there and you want a good site that allows people from most states to gamble, go to MyBookie. MyBookie is a fantastic site, and I've been having a lot of fun with that recently in the conference championship game, so we're going to go ahead and shout that out. But Once again, as we break down this tournament in the field of 64, I said there were 68 teams. So we're going to have 4 games that are what are called play-in games to see what teams get in at what spots. Now, you think this would be the 4 lowest seeded teams, but actually, in a surprise, the play-in games are going to be for the 11 seed in the East region, the 16 seed in the East region, and the same seeds for the West, the 11 and the 16 seeds. Those teams will go on to play, obviously, the 16 seed will play the number 1 seed in their separate regions, and the 11 seed will go on to play the 6 seed in their separate regions. So a little bit of intrigue in probably the 11 seed matchups. Once again, if you've never watched the tournament before, I'm uttering complete nonsense. Let's actually get down and we're going to break this down. Because in the 4 regions, we have the West, we have the East, we have the South, and we have the Midwest. We're going to start in the West division. Now, in the first round here, we're going to take away every single matchup. I'm going to give you my quick take, and we're going to break it down all the way through the region before giving you the region's champion and moving on to the next. After the 4 regions are completed, I'm going to go ahead and summarize the final 4, the national championship game, and then kick off a little bit at the end of the show before leaving y'all here for the night. But let's break into the first game that's going to be happening here in the West region. That's going to be number 1 Gonzaga versus the winner of Norfolk State and Appalachian State. Now, Norfolk State and Appalachian State, I'm sure they're very happy to be playing in a playing game. Welcome to the dance. Thank you guys for coming. I hope your trip to Indianapolis was fantastic. But to be honest, it doesn't matter if you win this game because Gonzaga, I think, is the favorite to win it this year. And spoiler alert, they're who I have winning the national title in most of my brackets. Now, I'm filling out multiple ones here, but we're going to do a special edition just for this review here. And Gonzaga is going to win this first round matchup handedly. If the point spread's ridiculous, like maybe like plus 35 to Norfolk or Appalachian State, I might go ahead and take the point spread, but there's no way I see Gonzaga losing this. Even if Gonzaga had their first 8 players have to sit out the game, I still think this team is deep enough and talented enough, they'd still run through either team that makes it through to play them. It's not even worth discussing anymore. So moving on, whoever gets to play Gonzaga from this game, we have number 8 Oklahoma versus number 9 Missouri. And this is actually a really close matchup. But I think it's a tale of 2 different teams here because you have Oklahoma, who seems to be coming on hot here after a strong showing in the Big 12 championship game. Most analysts here really like their wins over Alabama, Kansas, Texas, and West Virginia, who are all top 3 seeded teams in different regions. And Oklahoma's hooked hot late. Well, Missouri seemed to start the season hot. They look to be a solid team, but have struggles as of late due to different inconsistencies, and I believe some injuries or issues with injuries and COVID as well. So for this one here, I pick Oklahoma for a date with Gonzaga, and we'll predict that one here in a second. Next off, though, I have my first upset potential. Now, I kind of based ESPN off for a couple of these different rankings. I'll reference Jay Billis's, predictions for the NCAA tournament a bit, but also I did have ESPN's top 10 giant killers that I'm going to be mentioning throughout this different one. And right here is going to be your number 9 giant killer at 21%. It's going to be Creighton versus UC Santa Barbara. Now, I got a special soft spot for both of these teams for the wins and the losses. For Creighton, I did make a pretty juicy parlay on Championship Saturday this past week when Creighton lost to Georgetown. I didn't pick Georgetown to win straight up because I guess I'm not that bold, but I still picked him with the points. And the fact that Creighton choked it in the championship game and got Georgetown to eke in, that was a good win for me. The second part of that parlay and the last part that I almost had to stay up the entire night waiting for it to hit because the game didn't start till 9:30 Mountain Time was UC Santa Barbara winning with the over-under on their game. And I love UC Santa Barbara. It's a fast running gun attack, and they're capable of dropping 80 or 90 points in 40 minutes any single night. And for a Creighton team that hasn't really looked on top of anything recently, I think this is a recipe for an upset. Now, ESPN put this as their 9th rated giant killer, but honestly, it's probably one of my favorite upsets to pick, and I'm going to pick it right here. So the first upset I'm picking in my bracket, number 12, UC Santa Barbara Guachos, upsetting the Creighton Blue Jays here in the West Division. Region, whatever you want to call it. Moving on here, we actually have, they're not going to be rated on the giant killer, but I have noticed a lot of different people talking this as a potential upset. We have number 4, Virginia versus Ohio. So the Bobcats out of Ohio here, another mid-conference team, pretty underrated, coming in here at the 13th seed. And Virginia is another team. When you talk about March Madness, you talk about teams who get hot at the right time. Just bringing up that former example of UNC, they just got hot at the right time. The unfortunate part is Virginia's not playing like that. They were expected to win the ACC championship or at least go far in it. And I think they were a little bit lower seeded expecting here. For Ohio, you think you're going to want a little bit more of a cupcake game as at a 13 seed, but you wonder if Virginia maybe gets caught here because they're a good offensive team. But if you force them to play one-on-one and you don't let them to get the ball moving around, you can slow them down just enough to beat them. Jay Billis picked Ohio here, and while that's tempting, in my bracket, I think Virginia picks back up for him and advances, though. Ohio is a tasty, idea for moving on to the next round, potentially also setting up that matchup with 12-13 with UC Santa Barbara versus Ohio. But like I said, Virginia is an experienced, well-coached team. I think they move on. Next up here, we do have a potential giant killer coming back in, the number 10 giant killer. First off, this is going to be number 60 USC, the University of Southern California Trojans, versus the winner of Wichita State versus Drake University. Now, if Wichita State pulls through in that playing game versus Drake, they have a 13% upset chance against USC, and that's going to be rated for the 10th best giant killer. To be honest, though, I don't even put this on my upset radar because I feel like in March, I like teams that have elite players, for those elite players to go off, even with, a perceived lack of talent around them. Well, USC may not be as deep as probably a lot of these Big Ten teams are, and even some of the SEC or ACC teams. I still think having a guy like Evan Mobley who can go number 1 this next year in the draft, I think that's going to be a huge problem for any team that faces him because he's a matchup nightmare. He's money in the low post. He's got a decent mid-range game, and he can pass out of it too. He's really what you're going to want in the NBA level as a center at the next level. So, the fact that he's a star for this USC team, I think, makes them a problem for bracket busting later on here. But I definitely have USC going over Wichita State, which I do think Wichita State beats Drake in that play-in game as well. Moving on, another one here is Kansas versus 14 Eastern Washington. Now, Kansas can go one of two ways in this program. I've heard a lot of people predict them to maybe even lose this game to Eastern Washington, that they could be caught with their pants down and they could be caught sleeping. But at the same time, I have people having Kansas going all the way to the national championship game and even beating Gonzaga coming out of this this region here. So it really can go one of two ways. Kansas, when they're healthy and they're playing all together and everybody's back from their COVID issues, you got one of the best teams in the nation and a team that should have won the Big 12. But obviously, the stories of shoulds and the stories of what actually happens is two totally different things here. However, I don't think Kansas gets caught slipping against Eastern Washington here. They win, they advance on to the next round. Final two games going into the West here. I have number 7 Oregon versus VCU, which is going to be the 10 seed. And this is going to be a good game here because VCU is a tough 10 seed. Usually when you get a small conference team going at 10, they've run up a good record. And the problem with the 7 seed is oftentimes you get a lot of major conference middle teams. So Oregon, though, they made it to the championship game in the Pac-12, unfortunately losing to Oregon State. Now, anything can happen in the tournament, and I believe defense is a recipe for success because VCU has it in spades. And the upset specials usually involve offense and high-scoring offense. Defense is always the second best way that you see these specials go, or upset specials go. And so, the story stays true. The saying stays true. Defense wins championships, and that's what VCU needs to win here. I think they can beat Oregon. I really do. And honestly, if I'm predicting in my bracket, I put Virginia Commonwealth over Oregon here because, well, Oregon's a talented team. They're longer. They're faster. Of course, they're a major program team. They're usually going to have those stereotypical better athletes to them. But for Virginia Commonwealth, a little bit more experienced of a team, a little bit more smart of a team, I would think so here. And once again, when you're talking about defense, that's always going to give you a shot in any single fight. So I'm going to have VCU go over 7-seeded Oregon here. And then I have Iowa versus GCU. Iowa, to be honest, is very strong, very deep. Luka Garza is a fantastic big man who's probably going to do fairly well at the next level. Grand Canyon University, I got love for it because I actually have cousins who go there. So shout out to Grand Canyon University. But hope you had fun at the dance. You're going home. Now we're going to get into the second round of the West region here. I got number 1 Gonzaga versus number 8 Oklahoma. Once again, this is Gonzaga we're talking about. We're talking about one of the best teams that's going to be here in this NCAA tournament. If you didn't know, they're undefeated right now, and they're going for history because no team since the 1975-1976 Indiana Hoosiers has finished the season undefeated and then gone on to win the NCAA title, finishing the entire season, regular and post, undefeated. Hasn't happened since 1976, and we're going to dig into the history of those teams later. But Gonzaga, they're going to run right through Oklahoma here because while Oklahoma's a good team, I don't think they can keep up with Gonzaga's scoring. And Gonzaga's competent enough defensively to play with anybody in the nation, but they're scary special on offense with Jalen Suggs. So we're going to talk about them more. We're going to gush into Gonzaga because I have them going deep in this tournament here. But let's move on to number 4 Virginia versus number 12 UC Santa Barbara. This one's going to be a tough matchup. And if Virginia's on their P's and Q's and they win in the first round here, unfortunately, I think UC Santa Barbara ends up going home because that sets up a 1-4 matchup in which Virginia is going to make a tough challenge for Gonzaga. I still think UC Santa Barbara has that potential to kind of make a Loyola type run because they can score the ball and they can score a lot of points. They've been averaging, I believe, over 83 points a game in their past 7 contests. They're crazy good at just getting the ball in the basket. Usually that means weak defense, but when you see a lot of these upsets in the NCAA tournament, you see these underdogs, offense is the key. If they can just run and beat you that way, that's how they're going to beat you. So, but unfortunately, like I said, I do have Virginia moving on in that matchup. Moving on to the next matchup in the West, as I predicted, I think Kansas is going to go against USC in the 3 and 6 seed. Now, Kansas had some COVID troubles, and the best player on the court is going to be Evan Mobley. So, can Kansas pull it together? Because like I said, once again, there's people who think Kansas can win the national championship. They're the team that comes out of this West here beating not only Iowa probably in the next matchup, but Gonzaga as well in the finals, in the Elite Eight. And while I like Kansas, I always do because they're a fantastic basketball program and they're, elite year after year after year. I like Evan Mobley. I'm going to pick star power multiple times in this bracket, and you're going to see why because there's truly some talented players coming out of this draft class. But I think the Cardinal and Gold upset Kansas here. USC moves on. Next matchup in the second round here, we're going to finish it off with Iowa versus, I believe it's going to be the number 10 seed VCU. Now, I don't think it really matters whether you're talking about VCU or Oregon at the end of the day, because Oregon can be a scary team and, they can send Iowa home if they do move on. VCU can pull that upset, though, against Oregon, and I think that's where the clock stops against Iowa. Either way, Iowa, they're just too scary and they're too deep. Luka Garza is a fantastic player, and they have players 7-8 deep coming off of the bench. They've proven it in a tough Big Ten this year because you're going to see a lot of teams that are coming from that Big Ten conference in this NCAA tournament, and they're going to be battle tested. So I think Iowa moves on here to the Sweet 16. Talking about the Sweet 16 here, we got Gonzaga versus Virginia, the 1 versus the 4 seed. Once again, I think Gonzaga, wins here, but Virginia can make this very interesting if they return to the team they are. But I think there's just too many questions and there's too many holes for Gonzaga to exploit from here. But if Virginia can play Virginia brand basketball, they can kick it out to the 3, play solid defense. They're good enough to beat Gonzaga. But once again, I still think if we're writing it down, throwing it in the chalk, Gonzaga is going to move on to the Elite Eight and the finals of the West region. And then you talk about the 2 versus the 6 matchup. You have Luka Garza versus Evan Mobley, 2 National Player of the Year candidates, with Evan Mobley winning the Pac-12 Player of the Year. And I haven't checked, but I believe Luka Garza won the Big Ten Player of the Year as well. And it's a great big man matchup to see. I would love to see USC win here. But Iowa, who's been dealing with some injury issues, I think at this deep in the tournament, providing they don't get any other major issues with injury, I do think they get rested up, and that sets up a great matchup between the 1 and the 2 seed, Gonzaga versus Iowa. Now, Iowa is going to have to play their best game. Iowa's going to have to be on point. Luka Garza is going to have to be out of his mind, and everybody around him is going to have to play the best game of their life. Now, it's a very ignorant matchup because I don't know very deep on Iowa. I don't know a lot of their players off the top of my head, but Luka Garza is going to bring the star power in this matchup. Unfortunately, Gonzaga is just too good. Gonzaga, you're going to hear this time and time again in my review. They're going to be undefeated, I think, at the end of this, or at least very close. So they break out of the Elite Eight here, beating Iowa and moving on to their first Final Four since 2017. So my synopsis of the West Division here. So I think it's an interesting division because you got a lot of big names and a little bit of star power here. You got top talents like Luka Garza, Evan Mobley, and Jalen Suggs, who are all going to be lottery or top 5 picks, leading up here in probably the next year's draft. So, it kind of ends up, a little predictable with a 1-2, Elite Eight final here. You got a little bit of potential for upsets here. I think UC Santa Barbara makes for a good pick. And then I think also Ohio with the Bobcats, you got to watch out. You're not going to see much other than Wichita State could potentially kick out USC if there's a bad game from Evan Mobley. And if Eastern Washington upsets Kansas, I don't know if I'd be shocked, but it will be a pleasant surprise. 7, Oregon and VCU can go either way. So the West is certainly going to be an interesting division to watch. Dropping on down, though, we're going to move all the way across the all the way across the nation to the East region. And we're going to start off here in the first round because we have Michigan playing the winner of the play-in game of Mount St. Mary's and Texas Southern. And I think Michigan is up there because right now you have this like 1A spot of Gonzaga, but I believe there's two 1Bs in the college basketball world. Now, the world believes that to be Michigan and Baylor. I'm more of a fan of Illinois and Michigan. And I'm going to explain why, but for Michigan, I think everybody agrees that this team is a good team and they're deep. And so you're going to see, kind of a different debate about the 1 seeds here, but there's really not much debating about, Michigan versus either Mount St. Mary's or Texas Southern. Either way, I think they win here and they move on. Sure, anything can happen, but maybe we save that for the next round. Because next up in the matchup for the right to play Michigan, we have number 8 LSU and number 9 St. Bonaventure. Now, fantastic name to say, and a team with a little bit of history that I didn't know about until I started digging into the history of teams. And we're going to cover the Bonnies in a little bit here. But LSU is a tough team. LSU, it seems like since Ben Simmons came there, has had a little bit of juice as far as their basketball program has gone. And this is definitely a team that could possibly play with Michigan in the next round. You're going to see a lot of these major program teams that have the athletic ability and the players who can play, but that's kind of the key word here that we're noticing is they can play like that because these teams are inconsistent. LSU could be an SEC championship, caliber team one night and, a team that could possibly give Michigan a run for its money, or they could be one of the worst teams in the nation the next night. You just don't know how they're going to play. But still, I think in this game, St. Bonaventure, who's kind of that more mid-major stereotype that you're going to find, they're a solid team. They can knock down shots. But at the end of the day, you don't really have that elite leading player for the Bonnies that could lift them up over LSU. And so I do think LSU is the 8 seed moves on here. Moving on to the 5-12 upset of the East region is exactly where I'm going to dig in here. And the number 4 giant killer in ESPN, we have 5 seed Colorado versus number 12 Georgetown. Now ESPN is going to give this an upset chance at 28%. And don't look now, but Patrick Ewing just did lead his former alma mater there, Georgetown, to a conference title. And this was a fantastic conference championship game. Like I mentioned before, they were playing against Creighton. Ended up beating them, and I only had them with, I believe, a plus 9 point spread in the parlay that ended up hitting for me and funding the rest of my NCAA shenanigans for the rest of the tournament. So you have a team here in Georgetown who's coming in riding a high, and then Colorado, who kind of dropped the ball in the Pac-12 tournament because they very well could have been Pac-12 championships. So this is all the makings of an upset. You have a top team who's on the downswing, and you have a, kind of a middling team who's on the upswing, and they're hot right now. They've been hitting the 3, and they ran their way through that Big East tournament there, or whatever conference they're calling it now. Georgetown's still in the Big East, in my opinion. But Colorado is the better team who I think proved consistently through the year that the collapse in the Pac-12 tournament might have just been, a situation of chance. Who knows? Because anybody can lose one basketball game in this, and it's all over. But in this one, I think if you're picking the favorite, I think Colorado does advance. But look for Georgetown to heavily upset, and I'll definitely base a couple of parlays on this, just hoping it hits on the off chance. Moving on, though, we got Florida State versus 13 UNC Greensboro. I think Florida State, they made it to the ACC championship game. They're a great team. Florida State always plays this really unique brand of like switching defense, which I love as a Miami Heat fan because it's like, your guys should be able to guard kind of 1 through 5. Obviously, you don't want to put a point guard on a center, but you're getting guys out there on the court who can guard multiple positions. You can have a point guard who can match up on a small forward for a little bit, and that just makes the defense a lot more fluid and flexible. And so there's a lot of pros and a lot of cons to this style. But I absolutely love what Florida State does with it, and I think it's going to serve them well in this tournament. And it's definitely going to lead them past 13 UNC Greensboro. I don't think there's really a shot for an upset there, but you never know because Greensboro is a solid team. I mean, being 13 as a mid conference team, they could shock some people. But still, at the end of the day, the Seminoles moving on here. Next, in the Giant Killer rankings, we actually have a twofer special. I have BYU as the 6th seed, and we have a play-in game. Number 11 Michigan State versus number 11 UCLA for the right to play BYU. And I think this is the scariest situation you could possibly have if you're that BYU team. Michigan State and UCLA have been looking good recently, with a huge exception to Michigan State. Now, with the Giant Killer rankings, ESPN disagrees with me a little bit more because they're having UCLA as the number 1 Giant Killer prediction to beat BYU. They have a 41% chance to beat BYU if they move forward and beat Michigan State in that play-in game. I personally like Michigan State to actually beat UCLA, even though they're the 7th-ranked giant killer with a 23% upset chance to beat BYU. I actually think Michigan State does it. I'm going to predict number 11 Michigan State to beat BYU here. And I'll start off by saying that Michigan State started playing like dog shit. They were playing horrible to start the year, and it was like, oh my God, is this like a Michigan State team? Sure, they're missing Cassius Stanley and Cassius Winston, but like, this is Michigan State. They're usually pretty talented year after year after year. We can always expect some sort of talent from them. But still, they kind of start to get their ducks in the row late in the year that you watch and get that mid-major, at large, or not mid-major, sorry, major conference at large bid at the 11 seed, kind of like UCLA does. And I think BYU, to be honest, honestly should be seeded as high as 6. They should have lucked out with maybe a better matchup. Because Michigan State, UCLA, sitting at that 11, you almost wish you had a 10 seed. Because these teams are hot at the right time and are seeded so low that they could make some, wreckage in the tournament. So I think no matter which 11 seed wins, I'm going to pick them as my winner. But in this one, I have Michigan State turning out over UCLA and then turning in turn to beat BYU, advancing on to the round of 32. Finishing off the region here in the first round, we have 3 more games. We have 3 Texas versus Abilene Christian. I think Texas is a special team. We're going to be talking about them more and more and more as my predictions keep going here in the next probably 5-10 minutes. I think they win this game easily versus Abilene Christian. 7 UConn versus 10 Maryland. I think UConn's the sexy team because you got the history. Both men's and women's programs have been fantastic throughout the years, with the women's program by far being probably I'd say late, 60s, early 70s, UCLA, great. UConn just ran women's basketball for years and years and years, and they're still one of the top teams there, but UConn's men's basketball coming in here as a 7. I don't know. I think Maryland's a tougher team. Having to come out of that Big Ten, is really it's going to be something that I'm favoring here because that has been such a hard conference from what I've seen all year. And defense can be the kryptonite for any hot team. And while UConn, I think, is playing well recently, I'm going to kind of go against that prediction that I've been, talking about this whole time, to where I think cold teams are kind of, maybe with the chance to get upset and the hot teams are coming through. I think UConn gets cooled off here and they get upset by 10 Maryland because, defense. Sure, the return of James Bouknight, for the Huskies, I think has heated them up. I think, getting your best player back, makes them trouble for anybody. But still, I'd pick Maryland in this matchup. I will, however, throw an asterisk on that because if UConn gets through this Maryland team, I think they can cause some damage in the next couple of rounds. And then the final first-round matchup, I think Alabama going over 15C Iona is it's pretty much a lock. Iona, thanks for being here. Rick Pitino's coaching him, so I guess I don't know how I feel about the Scandal Master being there, but hey, he's a good coach. He's definitely won NCAA championships before, so we'll see what happens there. But I think the stars would need to align for Iona to win here because Bama's just a solid team. That football success has kind of transferred over to their basketball program. Now, in the second round, I did predict Michigan to face LSU. Now, LSU, like I said, has the talent to win this game. But number 1 seeds, they're there because they consistently perform. In LSU, we have not seen the consistency. So while it's going to be fun, it's going to be tempting to pick LSU to beat Michigan here. I still think Michigan wins and they advance on. For the right to play them, quote unquote, right, we have Florida State versus Colorado. Now, coming out of here, you have 2 different teams. You have a Colorado team that definitely could get upset by Georgetown in the first round. Florida State, I pretty much have them as a lock to move through. So we'll see. But at the end of the day, I think when you play this game, I think turnovers have been a huge issue for Florida State. The first round is going to tell you a lot about this matchup, but if they can ratchet everything up, play clean like they did most of the ACC tournament, they definitely beat this Colorado squad because they're just more talented and they just should beat Colorado. The switch defense can give the Buffs nightmares. Move them on to the next round to play Michigan. Now, my upset special, Michigan State versus Texas. I'd hate to see Michigan State run into Texas here, but that's obviously where they go if they win, because I don't think Texas, loses to Abilene Christian. I think Texas is a special team, and I think they're good. Their biggest issue, though, is on their best day, they're a top 5 team, and on their worst day, they're that 11 seed that Michigan State is. You don't know what kind of team that you're going to get with Texas, but lately that trend has been going upwards. And I think coming in as a 3 seed, Texas hits a hot streak going into this tournament. They take care of Michigan State, no problem, along with Alabama taking care of Maryland or UConn, whichever team comes through there. However, though, if it's UConn, expect a tough game with Alabama because UConn, you never actually know what's going to happen with them. They're always one of those, March sleepers that the university itself carries a little bit of magic this time of year. Still, though, the East, I think, is going to kind of come up to a pretty basic Sweet 16. It's going to be your basic 1-4 and 2-3 matchups. Michigan versus Florida State. And Michigan may, find that FSU's biggest strength here could be a flaw. I think that Michigan is really quick. I think switch defense doesn't work with a team that is athletically superior. That's where Florida State kind of gets the switch defenses. They get a lot of these long, very athletic, talented guys. And that's where the switch defense works. But it doesn't happen when a team is better than you in that athletic department. I think Michigan is a deeper team than Florida State. So, while I don't know if that's the way that they beat them, is exposing the switch defense, or, if they just keep playing Michigan basketball. But once again, I just think they're a better team. I think Michigan wins out over Florida State here. Moving on to the next matchup, the 2-3 Alabama and Texas. This is going to be a fantastic game, and you would swear you were watching probably the football national championship with it being Bama versus Texas. But I still think, even though the Bama's a higher seeded team and we've seen a little bit more success out of them, I think Texas, they hit that hot streak that I've been talking about, and they go through to the next round because Texas has a higher ceiling. And in the Big 12, I think they faced a little bit harder competition going up against the likes of Oklahoma, Kansas, just to name a few, and Texas Tech in that division. So we'll see what happens moving on to the Elite Eight here, because I do have number 1 Michigan playing Texas. Now, in this bracket where I'm predicting Texas to go all the way through against Michigan, Texas is just coming off of a win against Alabama, and I feel like Michigan, it's not that much of an uplifter to beat Florida State. So I think Texas is riding that emotional high. You know what? Fuck it. They catch Michigan napping, Texas to the Final Four. I'm going to take Texas as my winner in the East region here. Yeah. So I mean, like I said, Texas, I think, has the highest ceiling of any team in the East region. They're quick, they're athletic, they have that major team size to where they're not going to be outsized by anybody. Sure, I think their rebounding can use a little bit of work, but like I said, on their best day, they could be anybody in this tournament. And so I think to move on and to play that Gonzaga team as, the East and West region are going to end up playing each other in the end there, I think Texas does come out of this East region. But, once again, the Sweet 16 finishes with the top 4. I think you can have in this East a couple of teams, maybe shock some people and kind of come up out of nowhere. But, still finishing with that, Michigan versus Florida State and Alabama versus Texas. You kind of figure the top 4 teams to kind of go out here and just kind of take care of business, move on. But once again, I have Texas coming through in this bracket, but I have also picked every other one of the top 4 teams in different brackets to move on to the Elite Eight. Sorry, Final Four. So, yeah, the East region is going to be definitely interesting to predict there. Michigan, Texas, Alabama, Florida State even could kind of come out of it. So, who knows? Could be madness here in March coming up, which, in tune with the name March Madness. I don't know if you kind of got that joke there, but let's go ahead and break it down in cringeworthy fashion. Just kidding. Moving on to the South region here. We're going to move on in the first round of the tournament. We're moving to the third region. This is going to be a very interesting region, and I'm about to blow some fucking minds. Because in the first round, we have Baylor versus the Hartford Hawks. Now, Baylor on paper, a lot of teams put them in that Michigan and Gonzaga category. They put them as, true number 1 seeds. They've been consistent all year. They've beaten the teams that they should have beaten. They should be conference champions, but they're not. And they're a good team who can shoot the ball. They're your prototypical good NCAA team. I feel like we hear about this over and over and over again, this team that can win 5 games in the regular season. But at the end of the day, honestly, I see a lot of holes in Baylor. I don't think they're playing nearly up to the pace they did earlier in the season, and getting knocked out in the Big 12 tournament, that's a huge sign of desperation. So while a lot of people are going to pick them to kind of run through the South region here, I do pick them to beat Hartford. But stay tuned because I don't think they last around for long. Next, though, I'm going to show a huge bias. Spoiler alert. Because I'm a huge University of North Carolina fan. I love the Tar Heels. I've been a huge Tar Heels fan ever since I've started watching college basketball. And I kind of picked one of the blue chippers. Fuck me for doing it, but it's too late now. I can't go back. But UNC with an off year, though, coming in at number 8, they're going to play the number 9 team, Wisconsin. And I think whoever wins this game has upset special written all over them for the rest of the tournament because they're going to bust some fucking brackets. I personally am. I'm going to pick UNC here. I think they're getting hot at the right time. Walker Kessler seems to be getting better every single game. You still have Armando Bacot, coming down low, and honestly, they're 4 or 5 deep at the power forward and center position. Playing those big men, UNC is just monstrous on the boards. They're the number one offensive rebounding team in the nation. It's not even close. So I think, that spells success. Getting second and third chances, sure, teams can key in them, and try to match them pound for pound with their bigs. But I think they beat Wisconsin here. But Wisconsin's a very, very much just as like to beat, UNC as well. I think the odds, it's like 55-45 is what I put on this game. I pick UNC, but there's a couple of brackets where, tugging at my heartstrings here, I do pick Wisconsin to win this matchup. But for this review and for the theoretical bracket we're going to be putting up sake, I'm picking UNC. Next is what I'm going to pick almost every single bracket here. I think it's the upset of the tournament to pick. 12 Winthrop versus Villanova. Now, for some reason, ESPN didn't even rank this on the Giant Killer matchups, and I don't blame them because when you probably look at the Vegas Sportsbook and everything, I don't think Winthrop's a sexy pick. Obviously, the name's not sexy, Winthrop, even though I kind of dig it. But Villanova, I mean, they're the blue blood program. You kind of just know them at this point. They're Nova. Yeah, I mean, when you can kind of shorten the name and you still know what they are, that's what it is. But you don't often see teams like Winthrop with the depth that they have. Because of the strength of this team, I mean, they have good guards. They have solid forwards and a decent center, but they're led by Chandler Vaudrin, the 6'7" lefty whose game is almost straight out of the 70s. He plays with post moves, hit mid-range jumpers, runners, little hook shots. I mean, the guy's, like I said, he's a throwback. He's out of the 70s. He looks like he should be playing for the Flint Tropics in semi-pro. And I kind of love something about that because you don't often see a 12 seed, which is, usually a good mid-major team. You don't see them with depth like this. And I think when you can start putting guys in those bench minutes and they can start changing the game for you, because that's when a lot of these upset teams, they start to lose the game, is when their star players are, 40 minutes in at the end of the game, or when they have to sit them, in increments in the first half and you give up that little bit of lead and momentum you started, boosting. If you got a team that can solidly play through 8 or 9 players, that changes everything in what you can do as far as beating some of these major teams who on paper may be more talented, but it's all one game of basketball. And I think this one game of basketball, more times than not, is won by Winthrop, and that's who I'm picking here. Moving on, we do have actually a ESPN Giant Killer special, even though I like 4 seed Purdue. They're playing number 13 North Texas, and they're giving them a 25% upset chance, and the number 6 Giant Killer. Now, North Texas, they have guys who can go off. I mean, they have 4 guys who have made at least 24 3-pointers this year, which is impressive because it's essentially saying with the amount of games they've played, they have guys averaging at least 1 3 a game. So you can shoot from beyond the arc, and that always spells success in any sort of game. I mean, just look at the modern NBA. If you can hit the 3, you can win. You're always going to stand that chance. It's like being an outside puncher in boxing. You're always going to get that puncher's chance. But the Boilermakers are big, and I mean big. They have a 7'4" freshman coming off their bench, for God's sakes. I mean, they're like that UNC team that I was talking about. They're tall, they're long, and they can defend and play inside. So Purdue wins here, I think, without a question. They move on. Next, we have another Giant Killer, the 8th Giant Killer special. We have Utah State with a 22% chance to upset number 6 Texas Tech. And a Final Four run a couple of years ago, though, has me all warm and fuzzy for Texas Tech, and I love the Red Raiders. I do. Their offense is charming in college football because they pass a lot and they just throw the ball all the time. And they're charming in basketball, too, because they've always had this kind of like grinded out mentality. And that Jarrett Culver-led Texas Tech team a couple of years ago shocked the world and actually ended up making a fantastic Final Four run. So I like Texas Tech here. I think they're a good team. Maybe they're not, the team that kind of made it deep in the tournament a couple of years ago, but still, they're a good, solid, big program. And I think they beat Utah State here, even though Utah State does have a solid chance to beat them. Maybe I'll pick Utah State in a bracket or two in the future, but so far I've been high on the Red Raiders to move on to the next round. Now, the South region is just ripe apparently with upsets because once again, we are going to talk about the 3rd giant killer in ESPN rankings. We have Arkansas versus the 14th seed Colgate. Now, they're giving Colgate a 35% chance to upset them here. I mean, Colgate can score the ball, and they can do it at a high clip. I mean, they can shoot the ball from outside. I think Colgate's one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the nation. And when you can do that, who knows what the hell's going to happen. Arkansas, apparently, teams just don't like him as that 3 seed. I mean, but I feel like they're versatile and, they could still be finding themselves a bit with young, freshmen who could still blossom. And March is the time that flowers blossom, and that's usually the time you see good players go to great. That's the time that legends are made. I mean, I keep talking about this star power that everybody has. I talked about Evan Mobley and Jalen Suggs for different teams, but Arkansas doesn't have that quite of caliber of player yet, but they have a lot of young talent that can rise through here. But if that youth and inexperience, plays against their factor, Colgate does have a lot of juniors and seniors that can pick that up, shoot the ball from deep, and beat them here. So Colgate, while I might throw a bet or two in on them, I'm still picking Arkansas to win here. Now, finishing off the conference and the region here, we have number 7 Florida versus Virginia Tech. And Florida's been up and down, and they're really kind of hard to predict. In an SEC where they have a lot of teams of inconsistency, it's been a wild division to watch all year with Florida, LSU, Arkansas. You just have a lot of teams that with a lot of questions, and especially someone as myself who's been like kind of on an outsider's perspective going in more so into like the championship weekends and like more hardcore coverage. It's been really kind of hard to follow the SEC, just like when I look at ESPN every 2 or 3 days and I'm like, wait, I thought this team was the dog. Wait, I thought this was the guy. Florida has the makings of the team who could have won the SEC, but at the same time, I think they're susceptible to be, beaten by Virginia Tech here. Sure, Trey Mann could be the best player on the floor no matter, who's playing in this Virginia Tech and Florida game, but they proved it solid against a tough ACC. It's a hard pick, and this is going to be a fantastic game, but I think Virginia Tech does upset him here just because I kind of like to throw a little bit of spice in this division. Florida very well could move on, though, and could be a hard team for, someone like Ohio State or even further on Arkansas or Texas Tech if they choose to move on to play. But like I said, for this one here, let's go ahead and give Virginia Tech the nod. Next, moving on, we have number 2 Ohio State versus Oral Roberts. It's a 2:15 matchup. I mean, it'd be cool. It'd be awesome if we could see an upset. You always tune in just for that potential, just for that shot. I just don't think it's happening here. I think, Ohio State's a fantastic team. That Big Ten was so hard to come out of. And the Golden Eagles played the Buckeyes previously in the year, and they kind of held their own. So, if Oral Roberts could, live up to the Ohio State billing, they've played multiple power teams and, didn't win, but, didn't lose by a large margin either. Usually losing in that 8 to 15 point bracket, which I know doesn't sound close, but for early in the season, in non-conference matchups, hopefully a team like Oral Roberts could find their stride. As a 15 seed, I'd like him to come through, but I just don't think they will. Now, talking about the second round in the East region, we're having number 1 Baylor versus UNC. And here is where I'm going to be extremely biased because I'm going to pick UNC to upset them. Now, emotional pick, but let me explain the logic behind it. UNC is huge. Once again, Walker Kessler and Armando Bacot are right now hitting their stride. And UNC, I mean, they're playing like we expected them to be when they were ranked in the top 25 in the beginning of the season. Sure, it's been a rough year, and a lot of these major conference teams haven't been playing up to their caliber. UNC, Kentucky, Duke, the latter two not even being in the NCAA tournament, for God's sakes. But I mean, once again, Baylor is ripe for an upset. I think UNC is just the team to beat Baylor. It's a matchup favored for UNC, just going big against a Baylor team who is guard heavy and can play on the outside. But if the ball doesn't fall for Baylor like it has been recently, I think UNC picks it up on the offensive rebounding side. They out-rebound a Baylor team that isn't as good as, maybe some people think they are on the boards. And honestly, UNC can out-rebound any team in this game. So in this, entire tournament. So I think UNC moves on against Baylor. Number 4, though, we have Purdue going against number 12, Winthrop. Does the Cinderella story continue for Winthrop? No, it doesn't. Because I think Purdue, the Boilermakers here, a lot of people, talking that first round as a potential upset against North Texas. Like I said, I don't see it happening there. I don't see it happening here. I like Winthrop to kind of move on against Purdue, to play Purdue. But it hits, midnight for the Cinderella story as I think Winthrop can and will win in round 1, but they get shortened up here against Purdue. Purdue's a big team. I like size to play in this NCAA tournament because if you're going to have a lot of shots missed, teams that can offensive rebound are always going to have a favor, this time of the year. Next, though, you have Arkansas versus Texas Tech. And as much as I want to go with the nostalgia of just seeing the Red Raiders win again, Arkansas is the better team. They have Moses Moody. I just, I think it's a game changer. And usually you have a better team with the better player, chalking the Razorbacks to move on to the next round. And then you have Ohio State versus, I believe I picked Virginia Tech, but, they could also play Florida here as well. I don't think it really matters either way. I think Ohio State's a deep team. I think Virginia Tech just can't match up with E.J. Liddell. And when you have a big guy who can stretch the floor, he's a constant triple-double threat with getting rebounds and assists, usually making wings and guards, fantastic looks and getting easy layups inside. I think Ohio State advances here because matchup nightmares is what makes March happen. In the Sweet 16 here, we're talking number 4 Purdue against UNC is going to be my prediction. Now, once again, if Baylor comes through here, I think Baylor beats Purdue, hands down. And I think UNC does too. In a big man matchup, to where both teams' kind of strengths are as far as getting inside and getting the ball to their bigs. I think UNC has the better bigs. I think you have up and coming players like Walker Kessler, who has, a high, very, very, very high ceiling. I think he's, potential, lottery pick player, and Armando Bacot, who definitely could be a lottery pick player, and they're going to anchor UNC to a win. That's the two names I'm going to keep bringing up for UNC. But Purdue does have a very strong shot. They're a solid 4 seed. They can win this game. They definitely can. But I think UNC moves on. But then we go to our number 2-3 matchup. We have Ohio State versus Arkansas, and I just think the Buckeyes are just more battle-tested. I think you're going to see these Big Ten teams when it comes to any other division. It just doesn't compare because all year long, you had Ohio State who had to play Michigan. They had to play Purdue. They had to play Iowa. Even Nebraska was scrappy enough, and they're not even in the tournament this year. But then you're talking about Penn State, which is, meh. Illinois, which is in the tournament, Indiana as well. It's a tough division to make their way out of. And so Ohio State kind of coming in here as a 2 seed out of the Big Ten. I like their chances against Arkansas. But once again, Arkansas could be a formidable foe. And I think playing teams like Virginia Tech and Colgate in the first 2 rounds, it's just not the same competition as what Ohio State has played all year long. But bringing it on to the Elite Eight, we're talking about Ohio State versus UNC. Do I still show the bias, the favoritism? You bet your sweet fucking ass I do. UNC is coming out of this region. UNC is back, baby. Your matchup nightmare and E.J. Liddell, forget about it. We got 4 guys deep who can play him. All right? Sure, all signs point to Baylor being here, and I think if Baylor does make it, if my extreme, favoritism does not show off as a UNC fan in real life, and UNC doesn't make it, and Baylor runs all the way through to the Elite Eight, and they play Ohio State, or they play Arkansas, they play Purdue in the Sweet 16. Any of these matchups happen, I think Baylor is the one who comes out of this. But UNC is a better team for beating Baylor in my prediction here. And so once again, I'm the happiest camper in the world because UNC is moving on out of this, region. So yeah, I still hands down show the bias going into the Final Four. But I think this is a weak division at the top. Ohio State's good, but Ohio State, Arkansas, Purdue, I think they all have holes. I don't know if there's necessarily a lower seeded team in here that can beat them. I guess if I'm going to pick a 15 seed in this entire tournament to upset anybody, I'd pick Oral Roberts to upset Ohio State. But I don't know, just the sex appeal isn't here besides obviously it being the division where my team's at. Villanova could make some heads roll, because I think I'm kind of maybe throwing in Winthrop a little hard there, but I've been throwing them in because they're just a sexy pick with an unsexy name. I don't know if Nova goes on here, they could beat a team like Purdue. North Texas could cause some craziness. So this division could be good. I like the South region, but maybe I'm just tunnel vision and focus it on UNC because that's who I picked to win. So moving on to the last region, I got the Midwest region. And these guys, this is going to be called the superhero region because you've got some big names here. Starting off with Illinois, who's got the superhero tandem there. You got Batman and the Incredible Hulk. Now I'm going to get to the names here. You got Ayo Dosunmu and then Kofi Cockburn. If I'm butchering the first one, I apologize. But you have essentially a fantastic wing and an amazing big man here. Mr. Cockburn, we're going to go ahead and keep saying that name a billion times. Kofi Cockburn is going to be one of the most fantastic defensive players, that you can have in, manning the center right now. They gave him the nickname of the Incredible Hulk because he's just been a defensive juggernaut all year for Illinois. Dosunmu, physical athletic nightmare that can drive and play defense and shut down the best player at any game. He actually ended up playing with a broken nose and a concussion, recovering from a concussion and donning a Batman-esque mask. So why not give him the nickname? Even though Marvel and DC kind of rival universes, we got Batman and the Incredible Hulk coming from Illinois. And that's a hell of an introduction because they are playing 16 seed Drexel and they win. Hi Drexel, thanks for coming. Bye Drexel. And if any of these 1 or 2 seeds lose in the first round, I'm probably going to eat shit for not predicting any of these. But I don't know. We'll throw like a buck on each matchup and, maybe win a couple of dollars if one of them actually hits. Because it's always fun to see a 16 or a 15 beat a 1 or a 2, but it just doesn't happen very often. Unless we get another Florida Gulf Coast in, but I don't know. I don't see any of these teams being that, but the madness of March is yet to see that. Moving on from my constant nonsense rambling, number 8, Loyola Chicago versus number 9, Georgia Tech. Sister Jean is not here, unfortunately, rest in peace. But Loyola, I think, is a good team. I don't think it's the team from 3 years ago. They're not the emotional lovers, but I think, once again, we didn't even know who Loyola was 3 years ago going into this tournament. They're A-seeded. They're a good team. I think they very well have the potential to beat Georgia Tech here. Georgia Tech's a hot team, though. I mean, they're fresh off of an ACC title run to where they beat Florida State, who, as I had as a 4 seed, in a previous region, and they're fantastic. I think Florida State's a great team, and Georgia Tech hit their stride at the right time. They've been shooting well, and if the shooting continues here against Loyola, I think they beat them. But I think Loyola is more of a solid, sound team, as you're going to find once again from that mid-major. The stereotype, I'm going to drive to the core. They're a solid team, a little bit more experienced, I think, where it matters. And I think Loyola Chicago wins here. So that sets up a hard matchup with Illinois in the second round, but we'll get to that. Because we do have a very intriguing 5-12 matchup going next. We have Tennessee versus Oregon State. And Oregon State, man, they're coming off of that Pac-12 championship. Part of my money parlay from Saturday. Love that I picked Oregon State for my stupid, crazy, this will never happen in a million years upset, and it happened. Oregon won the Pac-12 championship. And because I don't think they'd be here if they wouldn't, because, coming in as a conference champion, being a 12 seed, it still speaks to the kind of regular season I think you had. I mean, I think they're athletic. They're a good team. They got they've got some good talent there, but I don't think they're Tennessee, because Tennessee is a team that is still budding, it seems like. They've got a lot of talent there. They're an SEC team, so they're going to be long. They're going to be athletic. But they got young wings in Jaden Springer and Keon Johnson, who I think could both be first-round picks in next year's NBA draft. And once again, this is where stars come alive. Flowers bud in March. We could see either Jaden Springer, is probably my favorite to come out, or Keon Johnson blossom into the wing, and a lottery pick here within the next couple of weeks. Stay tuned, because I think Tennessee wins here, but don't take Oregon State out yet, because it's a gritty team who could definitely give Tennessee some fits. Moving on, though, once again, ESPN is going to jump back in with their Giant Killer predictions, the number 5 Giant Killer. We have Oklahoma State versus number 13 Liberty, and Oklahoma State's going to be ranked 4th. I have a huge soft spot for Oklahoma State. I think Cade Cunningham is number one, another one of those players like Evan Mobley from USC, who's the term generational talent, I think it's used too often, but I'm going to use it here. I think Cade Cunningham's a generational talent. He reminds me a lot of like a LaMelo Ball, a big-bodied point guard. He can pass, he can shoot. He's still kind of developing all of those tools, but you see those splashes of, Hall of Fame potential, coming at Oklahoma State. And I think he leads a team that, honestly, outside of him, is a little underrated. They have good shooters around him. They have good players around him in Oklahoma State. They wouldn't be the 4 seed if not, coming from a rather hard Big 12. So Liberty is a solid team. They're a scoring team, and that is always your recipe for success when it comes to upsetting anybody. ESPN is giving them a 26% chance to upset Oklahoma State here. I just don't even think it's that likely, because I'm picking Oklahoma State to run through this matchup every single time. I don't know. Liberty has made appearances over and over and over again in the NCAA tournament. They are a little battle tested as a program. Obviously, that doesn't say much for the kids who are there 4 years at a time, but I don't know. It'd be cool. It'd be kind of cool to see, I guess. But I'm such a huge Cade Cunningham fan. I would rather see Oklahoma State, and that's what I'm going to. That's what I'm going to predict almost every single time. Is that Cade Cunningham is going to lead Oklahoma State definitely through this first round matchup. Back-to-back Giant Killers here. We have the number 2 predicting Giant Killer. We have number 11 Syracuse with a 39% chance to upset San Diego State, who's coming as the 6th seed here. And if this upset happens, I think it's because of a good matchup and nothing else. Syracuse obviously is famed for running, their Boeheim-based zone, which is, I believe it's like a 2-3 zone. Gives teams fits a lot of the times. And when Syracuse has had fantastic talent there, and they've had these, elite playmakers, and you've seen Syracuse be in the Elite Eight and the Final Four, and they're winning, tournaments, because they were in the Big East, and they were kings of the Big East for a long time. But I don't know. This Syracuse team just kind of is like one of the worst Syracuse teams I think that just I've seen from my brief kind of time, like seeing highlights and stuff. Like they're not as quick to play that zone. I think it almost becomes a curse against them half the time because if you get a team that is extremely quick and athletic, I think Syracuse doesn't know what to do with it. I mean, I think Bobby Boheim, Jim's son, their coach's kid, I think he could drop 30 against any team in the nation. So, well, you have an under-talented team with a good scheme and an ultra-talented point guard. I can see Syracuse upsetting Ohio or San Diego State here, but in my bracket, I'm picking San Diego State to go on because San Diego State is also, they've played the role of that Cinderella before. They've played kind of the role of the killer, and they've worked their way to be that really respected program, kind of coming out of the Mountain West Conference. So, once again, I'd love to see Syracuse do this here, but for my pick, I'm picking San Diego State. Next, number 3 West Virginia versus number 14 Morehead State, and I love Morehead State. I think whenever they make the NCAA tournament, they're such a fun watch. And this year, I mean, they have that personality. You're talking about a team who I kind of started picking up a little bit before championship week. I was really hoping they win their conference championship so they could get in, and they did. And they got in as a 14 seed, so that's a little low from where I was kind of wanting them. But their bench has gone viral because they've gotten warnings from the referees a couple of times for just, celebrating really excessively and just, kind of even scaring some people that are in the arena at the time. But they're 19-1 since the calendar year turned over in 2021. And they played competition all year, hard competition all year. I think for them to be low as 14 is insulting, but I think it has upset potential here. Because turnovers has really just kind of been the Achilles heel of Morehead State all year. If they could ratchet that up and they could be a clean basketball team, they could almost beat anybody in this region. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen here. I'm going to start fucking with my bracket a little bit more because I don't like this West Virginia team. I think they played in a hard Big 12, but they're very upset ready. I don't think they rebound as well. And if Morehead State ends up playing a clean game of basketball, they could run away with this one and end up outscoring West Virginia. So Morehead State wins here with a 14-3. And I think it's my biggest upset I predicted so far. So let's go on to, after that big upset, let's go to Clemson versus Rutgers. And I really like Rutgers here, and I'm going to explain why. Because I think Clemson, while playing in the ACC, is a tough division. I think Rutgers has just been driven through the muck. I mean, they're a team that at one point was ranked in the beginning of the year. They beat teams like Illinois. They've hung in there with Ohio State, with Michigan, and they've beat the likes of Iowa. But then they've also lost to teams like Nebraska and Indiana that's not even in the tournament this year. The Big Ten up and down is a hard division this year. So I think anybody coming out of there, they're coming in a little scarred, but they're also coming up a little callous too. They're tough. They're going to be teams that can kind of play those nitty gritty teams, and I just don't see Clemson being as tough as Rutgers here. So I'm going to pick the Scarlet Knights to upset again here. I think number 10 Rutgers beats Clemson. And moving on to the final matchup, we have number 2 Houston versus Cleveland State. I think Houston wins. I think they can defend and rebound with the best, and they usually just tend to be staples this time of year. If you can box out, you can play the boards, you can play the good fundamental basketball. You can win games. It might not be sexy, but defense wins championships, and rebounding, it's just an all-around part of the game. So Houston advances here because I just don't see Cleveland State beating them. Moving on to the second round, we have Illinois, which is the number 1 seed, versus Loyola Chicago. I think Loyola can give Illinois fits. I like their style of play. I think Loyola can play good defense. They can drain the 3, but enough's enough at the end of the day. I mean, if I want to place a fun bet, cool, but I think Illinois runs through Loyola here. They're a fun team. They're a deep team. I think they have both the superstars on there and the playmaking potential, positions, importance 3 through 7, just to kind of make a deep run in this tournament. I think you'll see how deep I had them in my bracket, but yeah, they move past Loyola Chicago here. And then we have the 4-5 matchup here with Oklahoma State and number 5 seed Tennessee. It's the better team versus the better prospect, because you have Oklahoma State who's rated a little bit higher, and I think Cade Cunningham, he should go number 1 in the draft next year if it's not Evan Mobley or Luka Garza. Those are the top 3, in my opinion. But the better team here is Tennessee. They're a little bit deeper than Oklahoma State. In the SEC Big 12, I think the Big 12 is a little bit more battle testing, but Tennessee played well in the SEC. Usually bodes well for the Vols, who are tough, a little bit more defensive minded. But like I said, I love to romanticize stars coming together and willing their teams to victories in close matchups. And I think when you have Cade Cunningham and you have the best player on the court, that's when it matters in the playoffs. When it's one game, win or go home, you need to win this game against Tennessee here. I think Cade Cunningham overcomes the Vols. I just don't think they have the talent to hold him back. And like I said, he's going to be the best player on the court in most games he plays. Can you stop him, though? Can you get those couple of stops? And I just don't think Tennessee has it in them. Could go either way here, but Oklahoma State, I think, moves on to play Illinois. Next, though, is going to be my super fucked up matchup because you could potentially have a number 11 Syracuse versus number 14 Morehead State. Because, like I said, I'd love to see Syracuse beat San Diego State. And I think Morehead State has potential to beat West Virginia. This could also be San Diego State versus West Virginia. Respectable matchup. I think West Virginia wins that one because if West Virginia, in the normal world, doesn't lose to Morehead State, like they probably won't. But like I said, we're predicting, bullshit here, and that's exactly what I am with Morehead State. I think West Virginia is a decent team, but also San Diego State might have a better chance of beating Morehead State. But fuck it, I'm still picking Morehead State to go through in this bracket because San Diego State, if they're going to be given fits in the previous round with Syracuse, I think Morehead can pick up on that and they can outrun and gun this team and end up just making it a lot farther. So, fuck it. Morehead State going on again. Let's just go ahead and pick them off in the round of 32. And then Houston versus Rutgers. I think this game is interesting because Rutgers, once again, has played, teams all year who are much harder teams to beat than Houston. I think Houston's coming from a weak conference. They're a good team. They're a really good basketball team. But I've just pretty much lost my shit at this point. Recording and in the Midwest region, I'm just going to say, fuck it. Rutgers going over Houston. Let's go ahead and set up that 10-14 matchup in the next round. Oh, man. Let's keep going here. You know what? Actually, fuck it. Let's go back. All right, Morehead State's not going to be San Diego State. I'll be honest about this one here. Let's keep San Diego State going on a little bit longer, but I'm still picking Morehead State to upset West Virginia. Fuck society. Next, moving on to the Sweet 16, though, we got Illinois versus Oklahoma State. Well, I talked about matching star power to where I was like, well, I think Tennessee doesn't have the star power to match up with Oklahoma State because Cade Cunningham's fantastic. Well, meet Batman and the Incredible Hulk to Cade Cunningham's Superman here. And I'm sorry to mash your universes between Marvel and DC, but 2 against 1 here. And I think Cade Cunningham, great player, but I just don't think they're deep enough to beat Illinois. I think Illinois, not like super embarrassingly beats Oklahoma State, but I think they handily beat Oklahoma State, probably, 8 to 15 point win. So Illinois moving on to the next round. And let's go ahead and predict the fun matchup of San Diego State versus Rutgers. I think Upset Row leads us here to a 6-10 matchup. Rutgers has a great ability to score in transition with their key playmakers, but can they defend and polish off, a well-rounded game with starting to make some three-pointers here? Can Rutgers shock the world and topple the Aztecs to set up a visit with Illinois? Yes, they can. And, at this point, like I said, fuck it. Rutgers beats San Diego State. San Diego State, like I said, they're a solid team, but they don't have a lot of that appeal. They don't have, like the Kawhi Leonard years to where, they have these players to lead them. I don't know. I see San Diego State as a decent team, but we're predicting the fun matchups here. If I was playing for money or something serious, yeah, I'd pick San Diego State, but fuck it. Scarlet Knights going through because it doesn't really matter because I think Illinois comes out of the Midwest. I don't think there's another team that really can beat them. I think Oklahoma and Tennessee can show some flashes. I think West Virginia, Houston, all roads lead through Illinois, though, and I just don't think anybody beats Illinois out of this region. So, they're my number 1 seed that I like on top of Michigan, on top of Gonzaga, as that kind of key group of number 3s. Because, like I said, I had Baylor going out in the second round to either UNC or Wisconsin could very well beat Baylor as well. That's a huge upset in the second round that could happen because Baylor, they're 1 seed. They're going to beat Hartford. That's most likely going to happen. That's like a 99.8% chance of happening. But in the second round, I think Baylor is your weakest of the ones. And I think Illinois is the most disrespected of the ones. But moving on to this Final Four that I've set up here, we have a little bit of craziness. We're going to start off with the way crazy matchup, Illinois versus number 8 UNC. And this is where I will stop my run for my boys. I have to be fair. UNC is a good team. They have matchup strengths, I think, that they can play into, and Roy Williams is a good enough coach to lead them through. But Illinois is just too good. Illinois is too good. I don't think that, UNC can beat them in most games. I mean, obviously, anything can happen. UNC's a talented team. Give them like a 20% chance to win here, but I think Illinois kind of runs through. So this is where my Cinderella runs for my boys, but I'd love to see a Final Four run by UNC. I think that would re-energize a program that has kind of fallen flat. Roy Williams is still one of the better coaches in the NCAA. I think he's still adaptive. I think, he's good at kind of going with the times a little bit. We've still been playing very traditional the past couple of years, not really getting much out for the three ball other than seeing like players like Joel Berry and Kobe White kind of come in and shoot well. But I don't know. I would love to see a Final Four run for my boys. But like I said, Illinois kind of pulls through. I have them going on to the national title game. And then we go across to where it's Gonzaga versus Texas, in my opinion. Now, Texas has that special feeling, and I think on their best day, they are as good, if not better, than Gonzaga. But Gonzaga, at this point, is going to be 30-0. And I think they make that 31-0 to go on to the next round. I think they beat Texas. Because once again, we're talking about if Texas is as good as they are on their best day, to where Gonzaga is most likely going just to be Gonzaga. They're going to play their brand of basketball. So we're going to set up a national championship here. Little not sexy, but it's a 1 seed versus 1 seed, and it's a powerhouse game. So here we go. Let's preview the national title game that we have, because on one end you got Gonzaga. You have Jalen Suggs, lottery prospect, possible top 5 pick, all-around guard extraordinaire. He can steal the ball, he can dunk it, he can shoot it, he can pass it. He's been absolutely fantastic this year. But you continue that with also seeing Corey Kispert, who's made his name known as one of the best jump shooters in the country this year. Drew Timme and Joel Ajayi are a couple of bigs for the team that have added solid size, and Ajayi has been a defensive menace for the Zags. They enter as only the 5th team ever to go on to potentially be undefeated. Sitting at this point, though, at 31-0 in the title game, the Zags have only had one game all year where they've won less than 10, by less than 10. So double-digit wins in 30 of their 31 wins at this point could be possible. They dominate every phase of the game, and they're just the undisputed number 1 team coming into the tournament. Obviously, you talk about your Illinois, your Michigans, your Baylors, but Gonzaga has just made their presence known at the top of the polls, and they've stayed there pretty consistently all year long. They're making a bid for history, but there's a pretty worthy team on the other side, because you have Illinois, who I've grown more and more in love with as I just read more of them and I watch the game tape, because Kofi Cockburn is an absolute menace. The Incredible Hulk is fantastic. And Batman, Ayo Dosunmu, he's a great wing. But you also have Andre Corbello, who's emerged as one of the next great Illinois guards, and Adam Miller, a freshman who can knock down a clutch shot for you from the outside. But then they have a wild card in Trent Frazier. It's a lefty who can either drop 25 on you, or he's either the best defensive player on the court. And I think that can cause some fits for some of the Gonzaga wings, because this is going to be an extremely interesting national championship game. You have deep teams who have star potential. They have power. They could really slug it out. I mean, we could see a single or double, triple overtime thriller here. These teams match up extremely well. But the problem is Gonzaga is sitting there on the cusp of history. Do they become the 6th, 7th, 8th team ever? 8th team ever to finish the season undefeated as NCAA national champions at the end of the tournament? Or do they become just the 3rd team ever to finish the season undefeated, make it to the national title game, and lose? I think Gonzaga wins here. Now, obviously, that's not to be said that Gonzaga is this super fantastic team. I don't think we're going to look back as like this top 5 all-time team. Potentially they have a lot of talent there. A lot of their players can transfer to the pros and maybe take that next step. Maybe we look back on this team that way, and they've played a fantastic year of basketball, and finishing undefeated would be a huge crown. I just think your middling competitions there is not going to be up to the caliber of some of the teams that I'm actually going to bring up here a little bit. Because as I finish off predicting that Gonzaga wins the championship, let's dig into those history books to end the episode here a little bit, because I'm going to start talking about those teams. Let's talk about the undefeated teams that finished the year as the national champions, and then let's talk about the teams that didn't quite make it, some of the best undefeated teams that we've seen in maybe my lifetime or my grandparents' lifetime. Pretty much, I'm going to cover like the last 70 years. Because with undefeated teams, let's start with the OG. Let's start with the 1955-1956 San Francisco Dons. This is a different time. This is a different game. And the Dons, they only had to rattle off 25 wins because they won 25 games, 0 losses, but they beat teams like UCLA, SMU, Utah, and Iowa, who were all, powerhouse teams at the time, playing in the original 16-team formatted tournament. But the Dons at this time had a man you might know as Bill Russell, man who would later go on to win multiple double-digit titles with the Boston Celtics in the NBA. So he started his ring of dominance here with the 55 and 56 San Francisco Dons. And I believe in the national championship game, he had like 21 rebounds, 24 points, 9 blocks. I mean, the man was absolutely dominant. So the Dons open up here as our first undefeated team to finish the year as the national champion. But the next year, we actually get our number 2 team, the 1956-1957 North Carolina Tar Heels, the first ever 32-0 team. Now, Gonzaga could be the third ever team to match this record, going 32-0 at the end of it all, if they win every single game through the tournament here. But this is coming 1 year after San Francisco, and a lot of people think this UNC team would be a little bit better. Lenny Rosenblau averaged 28 points a game, while Pete Brennan pulled in about 10 points a game. They beat Wilt Chamberlain and Kansas in a triple overtime thriller in the national championship game, 54-53. But that followed a triple overtime thriller in the Final Four against UNC that had against Michigan State. So think about that. Not only do they have to play 2 halves of basketball in each of those games, leading to 2 basketball games, but they play 3 overtime periods in both of those games for a total of 4 periods and 6 overtime periods across, a couple of days. This team really had to grind it out to get that 32-0, but to be the second ever undefeated team, well worth it. Now, I'm going to take a little introduction here because we're going to introduce you to the greatest basketball team of all time. And that's going to be the UCLA Bruins. Now, they haven't been probably much to note the past 20, 30 years. There's a run of dominance that they had in the 60s and 70s that was unparalleled, and we're going to go ahead and cover that here because literally the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th undefeated teams in history are all UCLA Bruins teams. We're going to start with the OG, the 1963-1964 Bruins, who went 30-0. And this is the run that started it all. Now, you may know UCLA for their bigs over time, Bill Walton and Lou Alcindor, later known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But this team was actually guard-led. They were led by Walt Hazzard and Gail Goodrich. Gail Goodrich, who would actually later go on to be an NBA Hall of Famer. But this team started a stretch of 38 NCAA tournament wins, which still holds up as a record to this day. And I don't think it'll ever be topped, because at that point, even winning in this year's tournament, you have to win 5 times to advance. You have to win in the round of 64, 32, Sweet 16, the Elite 8, the semifinals, and then I can't count because now I'm counting the national championship as the 6th win. So even then, though, you're still talking about 6+ years, getting to 7 NCAA tournaments and making it at least to the Sweet 16 in that 7th tournament in order to match what UCLA did, rattling off 38 straight NCAA tournament wins. Sure, it was in a time of smaller tournament sizes, but at the end of the day, though, I think this is starting the stretch of the most dominant sports program, team, franchise, whatever you want to call it, ever. Because then moving on in 1966 and 67, here's your second helping of the UCLA for the 30-0 team that's going to be the UCLA Bruins. And this is the first season that you're going to see a young kid named Lou Alcindor kind of come out in his sophomore year, which is his first year of eligibility. Because at the time in the NCAA, they actually did not allow freshmen to compete in their first year. They had to redshirt the first year automatically, and then they had their eligibility afterwards to start playing in their sophomore year. And he just hit the ground running. I mean, player of the year. What else do you want to say besides, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is literally the NBA's leading all-time scorer. But with this team, it's funny because John Wooden actually said that the team that came after this team was the best team that he ever coached. But the 66-67 Bruins finished 30-0. The next year, the Bruins were predicted to go undefeated again and win the national championship. And they did just one of those things. They won the national championship. But early in the year, they end up losing to a Houston team, later dubbed in the greatest game of the century, in which Houston beat them by 1 point. It was one of the first televised games, or I think the first televised game ever for college basketball. And I mean, people loved this. UCLA was this big giant no one thought was going to lose that year, and Houston took them down. But as we're going to talk about a little bit later, UCLA came back and got their revenge, ended up winning in 67 and 68. And that's actually what John Wooden would call his greatest team ever. I'm going to move on, though, because those are the 3rd and 4th undefeated teams. we have to combine numbers 5 and 6 because from 1971 to 1973, the UCLA Bruins didn't lose. They were 60-0. I mean, sure, it's cheating to kind of combine both teams, but Bill Walton at this point had made himself known, and he was phenomenal. Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is obviously a name he switched to in the pros. So Lou Alcindor may be known as the best player in college basketball, especially for the UCLA program. But I think Bill Walton definitely made himself a solid number 2 here. I mean, he was dominating to the point you can't even cover it in depth. They were winning NCAA tournament games by 20 and 30 points, beating everybody out by double digits. He established himself as an amazing player in the 1972 NCAA tournament, but in 73, Walton put off a performance that I don't think we're ever going to see. In the entire tournament, Walton missed one shot. Let's run that back there. Bill Walton, in the entire tournament, which I believe only lasted 4 games, but still missed one shot, going 21 and 22 and dominating in every big man facet of the game, out-rebounding and just outplaying anybody else who was on the same court as him. Unfortunately, Bill Walton's injuries, would kind of cut his career a little bit short of the greatness that could have been. Winning a title in Portland and obviously another one in Boston as a 6th man. I'll forever love him as a commentator because that's how I was introduced to him and then retroactively got to study him as a player. But man, Bill Walton in his prime, special player for this UCLA Bruins team that ends up going 16-0 across 2 seasons. Now, finally, let's bring up the last undefeated team, and this is one you're going to hear throughout the NCAA tournament because it's the last one to do it, the 1975 and 1976 Hoosiers. Now, there's only 2 teams who have ever gone undefeated and gone 32-0. That Tar Heels team that we talked about and the 75-76 Hoosiers team. And they have the bragging rights because they're the last ones to do it. They did an expanded, albeit seedless team, 32-team tournament, but a 32-team NCAA tournament that was the biggest of any undefeated team who's finished so far. Little under half the size of the tournament we have now, but it's a miniature version of what we would see for the past 24 years in the 64-team tournament that added 4 play-in seeds, just a couple of years ago. But Indiana was the complete team. Stars Scott May, Quinn Buckner, and Kent Benson still are remembered in Indiana fondly, and they've been the ghost people who have been chasing for like 45 years as far as who is going to be that next undefeated team. Because we've had some challengers. We've had 12 teams overall, that were in that kind of almost group. They finished the regular season undefeated, and they moved on to the NCAA tournament. Some teams actually had a fairly good shot at making, that undefeated run because there were playing times when the NCAA tournament was a 16-team tournament. You have to win 3 games to win out, and that's it. But, alas, we do have that group of those 12 teams, the teams that finished the NCAA tournament or the NCAA regular season. But then when it came time to tournament time, either they just couldn't cut the mustard, or they made it all the way to the end just to slip. Well, let's start and cover them just to finish off the episode. Here we have the 1950-1951 Columbia Lions, finishing with a record of 21-1. Now, Columbia doesn't seem like a basketball powerhouse, but back in the 1950s, the Ivy League actually, they could ball a little bit. Harvard, Columbia, Yale, Brown, these schools had pretty decent basketball teams. And they had a solid team, but they ended up losing in the first round of a 16-team tournament to Illinois. It's often forgotten in history, but could you imagine the top-ranked undefeated team? Like, if Gonzaga actually loses in the first round, people will shit bricks and lose their fucking minds. Columbia did it in 1950, and we don't even remember it. So, it'd be almost 10 years, though, until another team kind of gave us that disappointment, though, because in 1960 and 1961, you had the Ohio State Buckeyes finish 27-1. Now, Bob Knight has been a part of 3 teams that have been undefeated in the regular season. He was a part of the 1974-1975 Indiana Hoosiers, the 1975-76 Hoosiers that we just brought up, and the almost undefeated 1960-1961 Ohio State Buckeyes, and he was a player for that team. The team, led by future Hall of Famers John Havlicek and Jerry Lucas, though, they were a thrilling NCAA team. They obviously, Havlicek and Lucas end up being Hall of Famers in the NBA later on in their life. So it just kind of shows the talent that they had there. But this is the first team ever that would make it all the way to the national championship game, only to lose in that one last final game. First team to ever do it, and they lost against Cincinnati, who actually did it a year after Oscar Robertson, the Big O, the first triple-double threat, the original Brody, graduated from Cincinnati. Cincinnati was kind of an underdog team, but still a solid program at the time. Ohio State could have been. They could have been, in this time, the 3rd undefeated program to ever be, before UCLA kind of kicks off its run of dominance in the 60s there. But alas, it wasn't meant to be. Moving on to the The third team who kind of finished the end of the regular season undefeated, but then faltered in the playoffs at some point, we've actually already talked about them. It's going to be that 67-68 Houston Cougars team. Now, you remember the team that played them in the game of the century, this Houston team that at the time, everybody thought, okay, maybe they could beat UCLA, especially when the tournament time comes around. Well, UCLA remembered that. I mean, they thought about it all year long, enough to the point that they beat them 101-69. UCLA absolutely thrashed them. They kicked their ass all over the court. And Elvin Hayes, I mean, he was, the entire team was like shell-shocked. I mean, even for a guy who averaged 37 and 19 in the regular season, numbers, by the way, that we're not going to see hardly ever again in the game of basketball. The Cougars, they struggled. I mean, they lost to Ohio State next because at this time you had consolation games coming, I believe, after not even just the Final Four, but, all throughout the tournament, which is only 16 teams. And so in this consolation game for third and fourth place, the Cougars actually lose to Ohio State. That's why they had the 31-2 record. They go all year, they go 31-0, get to the Final Four, and then boom, loss. So it kind of puts a little burn because there's a lot of teams on this list who are those one-seeded teams or one-loss teams, but you're going to see a couple here that are going to have those 2 losses just because of those consolation games. And the next one's going to be number 4, the 1967-1968 St. Bonaventure Bonnies. We talked about them in the tournament here. They're a 9 seed. I think they could beat LSU. They could cause some problems for some people, but back in 1967-68, man, they were the fucking problem. Seriously, I mean, it is kind of weird seeing 2 losses for a team, though. Like I said, going back, the Houston Cougars the year before the same year ended up losing. But the Bonnies, they finished the season undefeated. It's kind of crazy seeing 2 teams finish the season undefeated and then neither one of them winning the national championship just because UCLA just decided to be boss that year. But I mean, you had Bob Lanier, who ends up being one of the best centers, in the nation, averaging 26 and 15, led him to a 23-0 record entering the tournament. But back-to-back losses against North Carolina and Columbia in a consolation game ended in an unexpectedly sour fashion. The Bonnies were kind of strong coming in, but then they just fizzled out of nowhere. Kind of a hard task for a team that finished undefeated, but that happens. Moving on, we got number 5 for the 5th team to lose it all after finishing the regular season undefeated. Marquette Warriors. At the time, I believe that the Golden Eagles now, but the 70-71 Marquette team was called the Warriors. A quick team led by legendary coach Al McGuire. Just a couple of notes on him here. They actually chose, I believe the year before, they finished in the top 10, but they weren't satisfied with their rankings, so they actually backed out of the NCAA tournament here and chose to attend the NIT tournament instead. But this next year, this Marquette team came out to a 27-0 record, and they were looking good going into the NCAA tournament. In the first round, though, you kind of see some of these big seeds who get upset. A lot, they stumble in the first round, and that usually leads to more trouble. And that's what kind of happened with this Marquette team, as they barely pulled it out against Miami, Ohio, 59-60. And that was bad because they stayed in state to play Ohio State, and, that didn't turn out well for them. Looks like Coach McGuire's son, Allen, was out of bounds as he ended up getting an inbound pass. And this allowed Ohio State to catch a couple of free throws as time expired to ice the game for him and end the season for the Warriors. Also in the same season, though, we once again saw another group of undefeated teams. We saw the Penn Quakers finish at 28-1. But finishing at 28 wins does not mean that you're great. And while Penn would make history in the tournament several years later in the Final Four in the 1978, this Penn team was hot until they ran into Villanova and got annihilated, 90-47. No consolation game, thankfully, so they finished with the 1 loss, but man, the way they went out, ugly. Now, we're going to bring up that Hoosier team that Bob Knight actually claimed that was his best team. At number 7 on my list, I have the 1974-75 Hoosiers. And this team should have won the national championship, but an Elite 8 loss in one of the classic games in NCAA history to, another great team at the time, Kentucky. They lose 92-90. And I think this is what toughened the team up, to end up, finishing the next year undefeated and being that national title and last undefeated, kind of champion team. Because this team should have been undefeated. They should have beat Kentucky, went through, obviously, shoulda, coulda, woulda. But this is probably the greatest one-loss team of all time, is that 74-75 Hoosiers team. I don't know, as far as teams that, didn't win the title, because I think, obviously, if we're talking greatest one-loss team, we got to go back to that UCLA team that kind of destroyed Houston in 67 and 68. But anyways, moving on, we got a couple more on the list, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. We have number 8, we have the 75-76 Rutgers Scarlet Knights. just kind of like years before, the Rutgers team kind of gets buried in history because it went all the way up to the Final Four, only to lose in the consolation games, in their last two games. In the 76 Final Four, you got Rutgers, an undefeated Indiana, Michigan, and UCLA. UCLA was post 1 year of John Wooden, and they would lose to Indiana. Well, Rutgers, would beat UCLA later on to claim, or Rutgers would lose to UCLA later on to claim the bronze medal in this year. Honestly, with this, I kind of forget where I picked up here, but it looks like you had undefeated Indiana winning the national title that year, and then Michigan, who's a solid team, going on to the national championship as well. But like I said, in 75-76, you kind of remember this year for Indiana's undefeated run. Not really much to say for the Scarlet Knights. Next, number 9, we have the 1978-79 Indiana State Sycamores finishing at 33-1. And if this team sounds a little out there but somewhat familiar, that's because this is Larry Legend's team. Larry Bird led this team to a 33-0 record in the national championship appearance in a 40-team NCAA tournament field before finally they met up with Irvin Magic Johnson and Michigan State in what was probably one of the most influential basketball games of all time. This turns a lot of people on to college basketball in the late 70s. And, it starts probably the greatest rivalry in the history of basketball. Magic versus Bird dominates the 80s, puts the Lakers and the Celtics on the map, and it all starts here with the 78-79 Indiana State Sycamores versus the Michigan State Spartans. Once again, Magic got the first upstep, as he kind of would not most, but a majority of the time throughout the rivalry. But Larry Legend would come back in later years. But man, the Hick from French Lake, this was his team, and this could have been a shot to go undefeated. But alas, they weren't exactly the most dicked down undefeated team, though, because actually what I read when looking into this, Alcorn State went 27-0 in 1978 and 79, but was actually shunned to the NIT tournament despite being undefeated. So they weren't even allowed a spot in the NCAA tournament. Crazy. But yeah, moving on to our last couple of teams here to go almost undefeated, pretty much undefeated and then losing the tournament. You have the 1990-1991 UNLV Renin Rebels. We talked about that Ohio State team that made it to the national championship game and lost. This is going to be your second team here that kind of did that. The Rebels could have gone 35-0. They could have been the greatest undefeated team of all time. But a last-second loss against a little-known Duke Blue Devils team with a young coach named Mike Krzyzewski kind of, took the Reading Rebels, who was they were a fantastic team. I mean, Larry Johnson and Greg Anthony, NBA Hall of Famers, Stacey Augmon and Anderson Hunt were fantastic college basketball players. I mean, they were a force to be reckoned with in the early 90s, defending national champions who rattled off 45 straight wins to that point just to get their ass kicked by Christian Laettner and Duke. And obviously that starts a huge run of dominance for Duke over the past 20 years that we may have just seen end, maybe, here in 2021, as Duke hasn't made the NCAA tournament for, probably the first time since before these years. But I don't know, that's for smarter people to look up. Last two teams that we're talking about here who kind of shit the bed, 2013-2014 Wichita State Shockers. I still have a pit in my stomach from this one, because they were such a cool team to follow. I like Shaka Smart. He had kind of pulled some upsets in previous NCAA tournaments. Wichita State was kind of getting that reputation of a good, solid, mid-major program that was just going to kind of hop higher and higher and actually be ranked year after year and, start getting higher seeds. And they did just that in 13 and 14. I mean, they got a number 1 seed. They finished undefeated and they won in the first round. But the unfortunate part is they got drawn an 8 seed in Kentucky in the second round, who is just starting to find their stride. Because the problem with Kentucky, obviously being a one-and-done university, is they have a bunch of freshman talent. So early in the year, they can lose some games. And they cannot, seem to be as good as they probably are. But as the game gets going and as these freshmen, kind of adapt to the college game, these are guys who are going to be top 15, top 20 picks in the NBA draft. And that Kentucky team handed them, unfortunately, in the second round. And that's where Wichita State's, season ends. Because literally the next year, we're going to pick up with a completely different, but also somewhat similar Kentucky Wildcat team. The last team on this list, the 2014, the 2015 Kentucky Wildcats. Now, this is the last team that finished the season undefeated, made it all the way to the Final Four, and then lost to the Wisconsin Badgers. I mean, this was a fantastic team. You had Karl Anthony Towns and Devin Booker, who are, perennial all-stars and future Hall of Famers, and also great college players like Tyler Ulis, Trey Lyles, and the Harrison twins, Andrew and Aaron. This was Kentucky's year, and their last undefeated team was back at the 25-0 team that didn't even play in the NCAA tournament because of player eligibility issues. They could have been undefeated and won a title. But nonetheless, Kentucky loses to Frank Kaminsky and a deep Wisconsin team that ended the miracle run. And that's going to finish it off as the last team to kind of shit the bed here. So, does Gonzaga follow which path? We'll see. But we're going to go ahead and summarize this one out here. Once again, thank you for tuning in to Beers and Bullshit. I'm a part of Top Wave Studios. This is Cole Blenner, and we are out.